Welcome to our deep dive into the fascinating world of contractions. I know you might be thinking, contractions, aren't those just basic English? But
Yeah.
trust me, you're in for some surprises. We've got a PhD dissertation
Wow.
all about how Turkish EFL learners experience contractions, plus some bonus material. So
Yeah.
it really sheds light on the whole contraction scene.
It's true. Contractions, they seem simple, but on the surface,
Yeah.
they're surprisingly complex, and they tell us a lot about how language works.
Exactly. We'll be tackling the big questions like, what are contractions?
Right.
And why should you care? But get ready for some myth busting, too.
Ooh.
Did you know contractions are more common and have a longer history than many people think?
Wow.
Some even argue they originated in written English.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly are contractions?
Okay.
Simply put, they combine two words by dropping sounds,
Okay.
often using an apostrophe to mark the missing letters. You use them every day. Can't for cannot.
Right.
It's for it is, wherefore we are.
Right. It's like a linguistic shortcut.
Mm.
Well, why should anyone care about these shortcuts?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
Contractions are everywhere in spoken English.
Yeah.
They make your speech sound more natural and fluent, less like you're reading from a textbook.
Right.
They also help you keep up with fast-paced conversations.
I've noticed that
Yeah.
trying to avoid contractions makes you sound stiff and formal, almost robotic, like trying to say, I shall not instead of I shan't. Nobody talks like that.
Exactly. And here's the myth-busting part.
Okay.
Contractions are often seen as slangy or informal.
Right.
But the truth is they've been around for centuries,
Really?
potentially originating in written English.
Wait, really? So it's not just about being proper or improper English.
Exactly. The historical use of contractions was often driven by practical concerns, like saving time and space when writing by hand. Even the Oxford English Dictionary doesn't completely agree with the idea that they're purely informal.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be afraid to use contractions. In fact, they're a natural part of the language
Yeah.
with a long and interesting history.
Now let's switch gears and delve into that PhD dissertation
Okay.
on Turkish EFL learners.
Okay.
What's fascinating is how these learners both embrace and hesitate when it comes to using contractions.
Right.
They want to sound fluent and native-like, but they also have concerns about formality and correctness.
That makes sense. It's a balancing act between trying to sound natural and making sure you're using the language correctly.
Absolutely. Some learners loved contractions because they found them easier to pronounce,
Okay.
and they acknowledged how common they are in everyday speech.
Right.
But others avoided them, worried about sounding too informal, or because they were unsure about the pronunciation
Okay.
or even meaning of some contraction.
It sounds like they're navigating a tricky linguistic landscape.
Yes.
What were some of the specific reasons learners gave for avoiding contractions?
Some learners simply weren't familiar with certain contractions,
Okay.
which makes sense since they're learning the language.
Right.
Others struggled with pronunciation and comprehension,
Yeah.
especially with the more complex forms.
I bet those multi-word contractions, like wouldn't have day,
Yeah.
can be tough to wrap your head around
Yeah.
when you're still getting used to English pronunciation.
Right.
Did the study mention anything about the impact of contractions on reading speed?
Yes. Some learners said that unfamiliar contractions slowed down their reading
Oh.
because they had to mentally unpack the words. It's like hitting a speed bump while reading. You have to pause and process it.
Makes sense. But before we move on, I'm curious about the reasons learners gave for actually embracing contractions.
Well, the number one reason was wanting to sound fluent and natural,
Oi?
like native English speakers.
Yeah.
They recognize that contractions are a key part of everyday speech.
So they saw contractions as a way to bridge the gap
Yeah,
between textbook English and the way people actually speak.
exactly. And some learners even found certain contractions easier to pronounce than the full word forms.
Wow.
It's like they were discovering a more efficient and natural way to communicate.
This is so interesting.
It is.
It really highlights the multifaceted role of contractions in language learning.
And here's where it gets even more exciting.
Ooh.
The study revealed a powerful aha
Moment.
love aha moment about how learners can improve their use of contractions.
Tell me more.
Well, the researchers found that providing explicit instruction on contractions made a huge difference. Learners became more confident and accurate in their use of contractions.
Okay.
And their fluency improved significantly.
So it's not just about exposure, it's about targeted learning that breaks down the nuances and empowers learners to master these seemingly simple but surprisingly tricky elements of English.
Precisely. Explicit instruction helped learners understand the rules and exceptions, the different types of contractions, and how to use them appropriately in different contexts.
This is such valuable information for anyone learning or teaching English.
Yeah.
It highlights the power of focused instruction in helping learners master even the most intricate aspects of language.
Absolutely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore the specific types of contractions the study focused on and delve deeper into the challenges and triumphs of mastering these linguistic shortcuts. Welcome back to our deep dive into contractions. We've laid the groundwork now. Let's really get into the nitty-gritty of how Turkish EFL learners grapple with these linguistic puzzles.
You know, I'm realizing that something we take for granted as native speakers can be a real challenge when you're learning English. It's fascinating to see it from a new perspective.
Absolutely. And the dissertation goes deep into the different types of contractions learners encountered. It wasn't just can't and won't. They looked at a wide range, which helps explain why some were trickier than others.
Okay, I'm all ears. What were some of the more challenging contractions the learners faced?
Well, unsurprisingly, those multi-word contractions like wouldn't or shouldn't have caused a lot of stumbling blocks. Imagine trying to pronounce those when you're still getting used to basic English sounds.
Yeah, I could see how those would be tongue twisters. Did the study say anything about how learners tried to cope with those tricky pronunciations?
It's interesting. The researchers observed that some learners would overcompensate by adding extra syllables or pauses, which actually made their speech sound less natural. It's like they were so focused on getting each sound right that they lost the flow.
It's that classic overthinking problem. Sometimes you just have to let the language flow. But I'm curious, did the study offer any solutions for learners struggling with these pronunciation hurdles?
Here's where the good news comes in. The study found that with focused instruction and practice, learners were able to significantly improve their pronunciation and fluency. It's not about avoiding contractions altogether. It's about giving learners the tools and support to master them.
That's encouraging. It's like learning any new skill with the right guidance and practice. You can overcome those initial hurdles.
Now, pronunciation is just one piece of the puzzle. The dissertation also explored how learners understand the meaning and function of contractions.
Yes, the semantics. It's one thing to be able to say a contraction, but it's another thing entirely to understand its nuances and use it appropriately. What did the researchers find?
Interestingly, many learners strongly associated contractions with informality. They almost had this rule in their head that contractions were never okay in formal settings.
That's understandable. Even for native speakers, we're taught to be more careful with contractions in formal writing or presentations.
Exactly. But the issue is that some learners overgeneralize this rule, thinking that all contractions were off limits in formal contexts. So they might avoid using can't or won't, even in situations where it's perfectly acceptable.
So they were missing out on the chance to sound more natural and fluent because of this misconception. Did the study suggest any ways to address this?
The researchers emphasized the importance of teaching learners about the different levels of formality, and when contractions are appropriate, it's not just about teaching the contractions themselves, it's about giving them the context to use them confidently.
That makes so much sense. It's like learning the social etiquette of a language. When to use slang, when to be more formal. It's all part of being a fluent communicator.
Now let's switch gears again and talk about listening comprehension. This is where things get really interesting for me personally. I've always wondered how contractions impact our ability to understand spoken English, especially when someone is speaking quickly.
Oh, me too. It's like trying to catch a fastball sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially when unfamiliar contractions are thrown in the mix. What did the study say about this?
Well, the researchers found that contractions can indeed pose a challenge for learners, especially when they're not familiar with the contracted forms or when the speaker is talking at a fast clip.
That's not surprising. Even for native speakers, we sometimes have to ask people to repeat themselves when they're using a lot of contractions and speaking quickly. It's like the words all blur together.
Exactly. And for learners, it can be even more difficult. They might misinterpret a contracted form or miss key information altogether. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with some pieces missing.
So are contractions the enemy of good listening comprehension? Should learners try to avoid them to make things easier?
Actually, the study found the opposite. Explicit instruction on contractions actually improved learners' listening comprehension skills. It's like giving them the missing puzzle pieces and strategies to put them together.
Really? That's counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about it. By familiarizing learners with the different contracted forms and how they sound in natural speech, we can equip them to process spoken English more efficiently.
Exactly. It's about building their confidence and giving them the tools to decode those contractions on the fly.
I love this idea of turning contractions from a listening obstacle into a listening advantage. But let's be honest, sometimes they can be frustrating to learn right.
You're absolutely right. The study also acknowledged the emotional side of learning contractions. Learners reported feelings of frustration and even anxiety when they encountered unfamiliar forms.
That's totally understandable. It's like hitting a roadblock when you're trying to learn something new. It can be discouraging, especially when you feel like you're making progress in other areas of the language.
And that frustration can sometimes lead to learners avoiding contractions altogether, which ironically hinders their fluency and naturalness.
It's a classic catch-22. You need to use contractions to sound more natural, but they can be so frustrating to learn that you end up avoiding them.
Exactly. That's why the study emphasizes the importance of creating a supportive learning environment where learners feel safe to make mistakes and experiment with new language forms.
So it's not just about teaching the rules, it's about fostering a positive learning experience where learners feel empowered to take risks and try new things.
Absolutely. And remember that aha moment we talked about earlier. Well, the study found that learners who actively sought out opportunities to use contractions in their own speech and writing made more significant progress.
So it's not just about passive learning. It's about encouraging learners to take ownership of their language development and actively integrate contractions into their everyday communication.
That's right. When learners are motivated and engaged, they're more likely to embrace challenges and experiment with new language forms, and contractions are no exception.
I love this emphasis on learner agency. It's about empowering learners to become active participants in their own language learning journey.
Now let's turn our attention to another fascinating aspect of contractions, the difference between how they're used in spoken and written English.
Ah, yes, the eternal debate.
Ugh.
We all know some contractions are considered more acceptable in writing than others, but I'm curious to hear what the researchers found.
Well, the study highlighted that while many contractions are common in both spoken and written English, some are definitely considered more informal or colloquial. Those are the ones that are typically avoided in formal writing.
Can you give us some examples of contractions that are generally considered okay for formal writing?
Sure. Contractions like can't, won't, it's, and don't are widely accepted in most writing, even academic papers or business reports. They've become so ingrained in the language that they no longer stand out as overly casual.
It's like they've earned their place in the formal world. But what about those contractions that still raise eyebrows in formal writing?
Those are typically the ones that involve multiple words or unusual pronunciations. Think gonna, wanna, or gotta. Those are best reserved for casual conversations or creative writing.
It's like showing up to a job interview in sweatpants. It just doesn't project the right image.
That's a great analogy. And the study really emphasizes the importance of teaching learners about these subtle distinctions. It's not about memorizing a bunch of rules. It's about developing a sensitivity to the nuances of language and how it's used in different contexts.
This deep dive is really making me think about all the subtle rules we follow as native speakers without even realizing it.
Exactly. It's a testament to the complexity of language and how much we absorb unconsciously. Now let's shift gears and explore the impact of contractions on reading fluency.
Okay, this is interesting to me. I can see how contractions might make reading feel more natural and conversational, but could they also be a stumbling block?
You've hit the nail on the head. The researchers found that contractions can both enhance and hinder reading fluency, depending on how familiar the learner is with those contracted forms and how complex the text is.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. On one hand, contractions can make reading flow more smoothly because they reflect how we actually speak. It's less stilted and academic.
I get that. When I'm reading a text with lots of contractions, it often feels more engaging and less like a textbook.
But on the other hand, unfamiliar contractions can trip up readers, especially if they're still learning English. They might have to pause and mentally decode the contraction, which disrupts the flow.
It's like hitting those speed bumps we talked about earlier, only this time it's happening in the reading process.
Precisely. And the study found that learners who weren't yet comfortable with contractions often spent more time decoding them, which slowed down their reading speed and comprehension.
So it's a balancing act between making the text feel natural and ensuring that learners aren't getting bogged down by unfamiliar forms.
Exactly. And the study highlights the importance of gradually increasing the complexity of texts as learners become more comfortable with different contracted forms.
It's like building up their contraction muscles so they can handle more and more challenging texts. But did the study only look at the technical aspects of reading fluency, or did they also consider learners' attitudes?
You bring up a great point. The study actually found that learners' attitudes towards contractions could also influence their reading fluency.
Oh, interesting. I'm guessing those who had negative views of contractions probably struggled more.
That's exactly what they found. Learners who saw contractions as informal or grammatically incorrect were more likely to stumble over them while reading. It's like they were approaching them with a sense of resistance, which made it harder to process them smoothly.
So it's not just about teaching the mechanics of contractions, it's about fostering a positive mindset towards them.
Absolutely. Helping learners see contractions as a valuable and natural part of the English language can actually improve their reading fluency.
This is all so fascinating. It's making me realize how much we take for granted as native speakers.
It truly is. Now, while this dissertation didn't focus specifically on language testing, I think there are some interesting implications we can draw from their findings.
Oh, good point. Language tests are a big part of many learners' lives. How do you think contractions factor into that?
Well, think about it. Many language tests assess speaking and listening skills, and we know contractions are ubiquitous in spoken English, so a learner's ability to use and understand them can definitely play a role in their performance.
That makes perfect sense. If you're not comfortable with contractions, it's going to be harder to express yourself fluently or understand natural speech, which could affect your score.
Exactly. It's not just about knowing grammar and vocabulary, it's about mastering those subtle features of language that make communication more natural and effective.
I'm starting to see contractions in a whole new light.
Yeah.
They're not just these little shortcuts. They're essential tools for effective communication.
Right. And the researchers even suggested that incorporating explicit instruction on contractions into language test preparation courses could be really beneficial for learners. It could help them feel more confident and prepare to handle the real-world challenges of using English.
That's a great idea. It's about giving learners the best chance to succeed in situations where they need to demonstrate their English proficiency.
Now, let's shift our focus to another fascinating area: the role of contractions in developing a natural-sounding English accent.
Ooh, accents are always intriguing. I'm guessing contractions play a big part in how we perceive different accents.
You're right. While this study focused on Turkish EFL learners, the findings are relevant to accent development in general. Using contractions correctly can help learners sound more fluent and natural, mimicking the rhythm and flow of native English speech.
It's like when you're learning a new dance. You have to master the basic steps before you can add your own style and flair.
Exactly. And contractions are like those basic steps for sounding more natural in English. They help you blend words together, create a smoother flow, and ultimately sound more confident and less hesitant.
So it's not just about mimicking a specific accent. It's about developing a speaking style that feels authentic and effortless.
Precisely. And the researchers suggested that incorporating explicit instruction on contractions along with plenty of practice in real-life contexts can contribute to developing a more natural-sounding accent.
It's like contractions are a secret ingredient to unlocking a more fluent and expressive way of speaking.
I love that analogy. Now let's dive into another key aspect: the impact of contractions on writing style.
Okay, bring on the writing insights. I know contractions are often seen as more casual, but I'm curious to hear how they can shape the overall style of a written piece.
You're right. Contractions are generally associated with a more conversational tone, which can make writing feel more relatable and less formal.
I definitely notice that when I'm reading texts with contractions often feel more engaging and less like stiff academic papers.
And the researchers found that learners who incorporated contractions into their writing often produced texts that were more concise and impactful, too.
So contractions can actually help writers get their message across more effectively.
Exactly. By eliminating unnecessary words and syllables, contractions can make writing more direct and to the point, enhancing its clarity and impact.
It's like decluttering a room. You get rid of the excess stuff to create a more spacious and inviting environment.
I love that analogy. And the study goes on to explore the role of contractions in different genres of writing.
Oh, interesting. How do contractions function differently across various writing styles?
Well, the appropriateness of using contractions really depends on the genre and the purpose of the writing. For example, in creative writing, like fiction or poetry, contractions are used freely to create that conversational, expressive tone.
That makes sense. When you're telling a story or expressing emotions, you want the language to feel natural and authentic.
Exactly. But in academic writing, like essays or research papers, you have to be more careful. The overuse of contractions can undermine that objective, detached tone that's often required in academic writing.
It's like showing up to a black tie event in jeans and a t-shirt. You're not quite hitting the right note.
Perfect analogy. And the study emphasizes the importance of teaching learners about these genre conventions and how using contractions differently can shift the whole tone and style of their writing.
It's about giving them the tools to be versatile writers who can adapt their style to different contexts and purposes.
Now let's zoom in on another nuance: how contractions impact the perception of formality in writing.
This is so interesting. We've been talking about formality through this episode, but I'm curious to hear how contractions specifically affect that perception.
The study highlighted that using contractions can significantly influence how formal or informal a piece of writing comes across.
So even if the content is the same, just adding or removing contractions can change the whole vibe of the piece.
Exactly. Think about it. In personal emails or text messages, contractions are everywhere. They contribute to that casual and friendly tone we use with friends and family.
That's true. It feels weird to write a casual email without any contractions. It almost feels too formal.
But when it comes to business letters or academic essays, you have to be more strategic. Overusing contractions can make the writing feel too informal for those contexts.
It's about finding that sweet spot, using contractions where they enhance clarity or create a more conversational flow without sacrificing the overall formality.
Right. And the researchers emphasize the importance of teaching learners about these subtle distinctions so they can make informed choices about their language use. It's about giving them the power to control how their writing is perceived.
This is making me realize that contractions are so much more than just grammar rules. They're tools for shaping tone style and even the emotional impact of our writing.
Exactly. And speaking of emotional impact, let's shift our focus to how contractions can affect the rhythm and flow of writing.
Okay, I'm ready to get musical with language. How do contractions contribute to the rhythm of a written piece?
The researchers found that using contractions can create a more natural and rhythmic flow, mimicking the patterns of spoken English.
I can definitely hear that in my head. When I read a text with contractions, it often feels more like I'm listening to someone speak.
Exactly. And the study found that learners who incorporated contractions into their writing often produced texts that were more pleasant to read aloud. It's like the contractions add punctuation to the music of the language, creating pauses and variations in tempo that make it more dynamic and engaging.
So contractions can actually enhance the auditory quality of writing. Like there's a secret ingredient to making writing more musical and enjoyable to listen to.
And now let's step back in time and explore the fascinating history of contractions in the English language.
Okay, time travel with contractions.
Mm.
I'm ready. I've always been curious about how language evolves over time, and I bet contractions have seen some interesting changes.
You're absolutely right. While this dissertation focused on present-day learners, it also acknowledged that contractions have been part of the English language for centuries. Their use and acceptance have definitely evolved over time.
I'm all ears. Tell me about the history of these linguistic chameleons.
Well, in Old English, contractions were pretty uncommon. But as the language evolved into Middle English, they became much more common. It seems that as the language became more simplified and colloquial, people started embracing contractions more and more.
So it's like contractions rode the wave of informality in language.
Exactly. And then during the Renaissance, the invention of the printing press had a big impact. It led to a standardization of spelling and grammar, which in turn influenced how contractions were used in written English.
It's like contractions had to adapt to the new rules of the printed page.
And over the centuries, certain contractions gained wider acceptance in formal writing, while others stayed more informal. It's fascinating to see how their social standing has shifted over time.
It's like they went through a linguistic sorting hat, with some ending up in Gryffindor, the formal house, and others in Hufflepuff, the more laid-back house.
I love that analogy. And the study emphasizes that understanding this historical context can help learners appreciate the significance of contractions and use them more effectively in modern English. It's not just about memorizing a set of rules, it's about seeing contractions as a dynamic part of a living language that's constantly evolving.
So contractions are like little time capsules carrying with them centuries of linguistic change and cultural evolution.
Exactly. And speaking of cultural evolution, let's explore the role of contractions in expressing regional dialects and social identities.
Ooh, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
I've always been intrigued by how language reflects who we are and where we come from.
Right. While this study focused on Turkish EFL learners, the findings are relevant to understanding language variation in general. The way people use contractions can vary significantly across different regions and social groups, reflecting unique linguistic patterns and cultural norms.
So contractions aren't just about grammar, they're about identity too.
Absolutely. Think about it. In some parts of the U.S., contractions like y'all and ain't are perfectly normal and even considered markers of belonging to a particular region. But in other regions, those same contractions might be seen as informal or even ungrammatical.
So depending on where you are and who you're talking to, a contraction can be a badge of honor or a social faux pas.
Exactly. And within social groups, certain contractions might be more common among younger generations or in specific professional communities. It's like using a secret handshake to signal you're part of the group.
This is making me think about all the different ways we use language to express who we are, even down to the tiny contractions we use.
It's truly fascinating how much meaning can be packed into these seemingly small linguistic choices. And the study suggests that teaching learners about these variations can help them develop a more nuanced understanding of the diversity of English and how language reflects those social and cultural identities. It's not just about mastering one standard form of English, it's about appreciating the richness and complexity of its variations.
So contractions are like little windows into different worlds of English, each with its unique flavor and style.
Now let's delve into another fascinating layer: how contractions can influence the emotional tone of what we say and write.
Okay, bring on the feelings. I'm ready to explore the connection between contractions and emotions.
Well, while this dissertation didn't explicitly focus on emotional expression, we can draw some interesting insights from their findings. Contractions can definitely play a role in conveying a whole range of emotions, from warmth and familiarity to informality and even humor.
That makes sense. Contractions often make language sound less formal and more like how we speak when we're relaxed and comfortable.
Exactly. Think about contractions like, "I'm so glad to see you," or "That's fantastic." They just naturally convey that enthusiasm and excitement. Or contractions like, "Don't worry, it'll be okay," or "I'm here for you." They can express comfort and support in a way that feels more genuine and less stiff.
It's like contractions can soften the edges of language and make it feel more personal and heartfelt.
Exactly. And the researchers observed that learners who incorporated contractions into their speech and writing often sounded more approachable and engaging. It's like the contractions helped them connect with others on a more emotional level.
So contractions are like little empathy bridges, helping us build rapport and understanding with others.
I love that analogy. And the study suggests that teaching learners about how contractions can convey those subtle emotional nuances can empower them to express themselves more effectively and build stronger relationships.
It's not just about knowing the words, it's about using them in a way that creates genuine human connection.
Now let's shift gears and explore a slightly more technical aspect: the impact of contractions on how our brains process language.
Okay, bring on the brain science.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by how our minds make sense of language.
This area of research is called psycholinguistics, and while the dissertation didn't focus solely on it, we can draw some relevant conclusions. Essentially, contractions can both simplify and complicate cognitive processing, depending on the listener or reader's familiarity with the contracted forms and the complexity of the language being used.
So contractions can be both a brain booster and a brain drainer.
You got it. On the one hand, contractions can actually reduce the cognitive load of processing language because they eliminate unnecessary words and syllables. It's like decluttering a mental workspace. By getting rid of the extra words, we can focus more on the essential information.
That makes sense. It's like streamlining the information flow in our brains.
Exactly. But on the other hand, unfamiliar contractions can actually increase cognitive load because listeners and readers have to work harder to decode them and figure out their meaning. This can slow down processing speed and make it tougher to understand complex information.
It's like those mental speed bumps we keep talking about. They force us to slow down and process the information more carefully.
Precisely. So the researchers suggest that teachers and language instructors should be mindful of these cognitive effects when using contractions in their lessons and materials. It's about finding that sweet spot, using contractions to enhance fluency and naturalness while ensuring learners have the mental resources to process them effectively.
So it's about striking a balance between pushing learners to expand their linguistic skills and not overwhelming their cognitive processing abilities.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating finding. The study showed that learners who were explicitly taught about contractions and given chances to practice them in real-life situations actually improved their cognitive processing speed.
So it's like we can train our brains to handle contractions more efficiently. The more we're exposed to them and practice using them, the easier it becomes for our brains to process them quickly and accurately.
Exactly. It's like learning any new skill with practice. It becomes more automatic and less effortful. Now let's shift our focus to the impact of contractions on how we perceive fluency and naturalness in spoken English.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into the world of spoken language. I'm guessing contractions play a big role in how we judge someone's fluency.
You're absolutely right. The way someone uses contractions can significantly influence how fluent and natural they sound.
I can definitely hear that. Someone who uses contractions appropriately tends to sound more relaxed and conversational, like they're speaking off the cuff rather than reading from a script.
Exactly. And the researchers found that listeners often perceive speakers who use contractions as more confident and competent in their English abilities.
So it's not just about sounding native-like. It's about projecting a sense of mastery and ease with the language. It's like the contractions are a subtle signal that you're comfortable navigating the nuances of English.
Precisely. And the study suggests that teaching learners about the importance of contractions and giving them opportunities to practice using them in real-life situations can help them develop a more fluent and natural-sounding speaking style.
It's like giving them the keys to unlock a more expressive and engaging way of speaking.
Yeah.
They can move beyond the textbook and start sounding more like themselves in English.
I love that. And now let's shift our attention to the impact of contractions on the acquisition of English as a second language.
Okay, let's get back to the learning process. I'm always curious about how different linguistic features can affect how learners acquire a new language.
Well, this study specifically looked at Turkish EFL learners, but the findings have broader implications for second language acquisition in general. The researchers emphasize that contractions play a crucial role in helping learners develop fluency and naturalness in spoken English, which are essential goals for many language learners.
That makes perfect sense. When you're learning a new language, you want to be able to speak it in a way that feels effortless and authentic, not like you're constantly translating in your head.
Exactly. And the study found that learners who were explicitly taught about contractions and given chances to practice them in real-world settings showed improvements in their overall speaking proficiency.
So it's not just about memorizing grammar rules and vocabulary lists. It's about mastering the subtle features of language that help you communicate more effectively.
Precisely. And the researchers suggested that incorporating explicit instruction on contractions into language teaching curricula could benefit learners at all stages of their language learning journey.
It's about giving learners the tools they need to build a strong foundation in English and express themselves confidently.
Now let's dive into the challenges and strategies learners use when encountering contractions in both spoken and written English.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of how learners actually deal with contractions in their everyday lives.
This dissertation provided some fascinating insights into the difficulties learners face, as well as the clever strategies they use to overcome those challenges.
Can you give us some examples of the specific challenges learners encounter with contractions?
Sure. One common challenge is distinguishing between contracted forms that sound similar, like it's and its, or there, and there.
Ah, yes. The notorious homophones.
Yeah.
I can imagine that being especially tough for learners who are still developing their listening and pronunciation skills.
Exactly. It's like trying to decipher a code where multiple words sound the same but have completely different meanings. And then there's the challenge of encountering unfamiliar contractions, especially those multi-word ones or the ones with unusual sound combinations.
It's like stumbling upon a word from a foreign language you have no idea what it means or how to pronounce it.
Right. But here's the amazing part. The study highlighted the resourceful strategies learners use to overcome these challenges.
Okay. I'm eager to hear about these linguistic problem-solving skills.
Well, one common strategy is using context clues. Learners would pay attention to the surrounding words and sentences to infer the meaning of an unfamiliar contraction.
So they're like language detectives using their powers of deduction to crack the case.
Exactly. And another strategy they used was breaking down contractions into their component parts, using their knowledge of grammar and pronunciation to decode those shortened forms.
And that was like they're reverse engineering the contractions to figure out their structure and meaning.
Precisely. And the study emphasized that teachers and language instructors can support learners in developing these strategies by providing explicit instruction on contractions and offering plenty of opportunities to practice using them in real-life situations.
It's about giving learners the confidence and skills to become independent language users who can solve these linguistic puzzles on their own.
Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to emphasize one key takeaway. Contractions are often seen as these simple, basic elements of English. But as we've seen, they're actually quite complex and play a significant role in various aspects of language learning and communication.
You're absolutely right. I feel like we've peeled back the layers of the onion and revealed a whole world of nuance and complexity within these tiny linguistic shortcuts.
Exactly. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll bring all of these insights together and discuss the key takeaways that you can apply to your own language journey.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into the fascinating world of contractions. We've covered a lot of ground from how they're formed to their impact on pronunciation, reading, and even emotional expression.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered about these little linguistic powerhouses. They really are more than meets the eye.
You're telling me I feel like I've gained a whole new level of understanding. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your key takeaways from this dissertation. What are the big lessons we can all apply, whether we're learning English or teaching it?
That's a great question. I think the most important takeaway is the power of explicit instruction. Learners need more than just exposure to contractions. They need clear explanations, examples, and lots of practice to really master these tricky little elements of English.
So it's not enough to just hope they pick it up naturally. We need to be intentional about teaching them the rules, the exceptions, and all those subtle nuances.
Exactly. And the dissertation suggested incorporating lots of interactive activities like role-playing games and listening exercises that focus on contractions in real-life contexts.
Yeah.
Make it fun and engaging, not just dry grammar drills.
I love that learning should be enjoyable, especially when it comes to something as essential as communication. What else stood out to you from the research?
Another crucial takeaway is the need to address learners' attitudes and misconceptions about contractions. Some learners might see contractions as informal or even wrong, which can make them hesitant to use them.
It's like they're carrying around this linguistic baggage that's holding them back from sounding more natural and fluent.
Exactly. And teachers can help unpack that baggage by openly discussing the different levels of formality and the appropriate use of contractions in various situations.
So it's not just about teaching the mechanics. It's about fostering a positive and informed mindset towards contractions, helping learners see them as a valuable tool for communication.
Absolutely. And the final takeaway I want to emphasize is the importance of learner agency. The research found that learners who actively sought out opportunities to use contractions in their own speaking and writing made the most progress.
That makes so much sense. It's not just about passive learning. It's about empowering learners to take ownership of their language development and consciously integrate contractions into their everyday communication.
Exactly. When learners are motivated and engaged, they're more likely to embrace the challenge and experiment with new forms, and contractions are a perfect example of that.
This has been such an insightful journey. I feel like I've not only learned a ton about contractions, but also gained a fresh perspective on language learning in general.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a reminder that language is a dynamic and constantly evolving system, and there's always more to discover and appreciate.
So to our listener out there, I have a challenge for you. Now that you know more about the nuances of contractions, pay attention to how you use them and how others use them around you. You might be surprised by what you notice.
And remember, language learning is a journey of exploration and discovery. Keep an open mind, keep experimenting, and keep contracting.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into contractions. We'll catch you next time.